Hey everyone, Eric Hayden here on YouTube. The third week of April and things are really happening in the garden. Hope you liked the last video where we did some pruning. Those were some time lapses going all the way back to February through most of the month of March. So I think you're going to see a pretty stark difference behind me showing you real time what's going on in the garden. A lot to talk about today. I want to show you a few different things in the garden, what to look for in terms of roses as they bloom in the spring months ahead. Also want to talk about some other things in terms of other issues you might be having in the garden with regards to dieback from the wintertime, and we're going to talk briefly about spraying. We will also talk about future videos. We're going to do an update on the roses from Steve Singer, the maiden roses, talk about something else I'm getting interested in, including a cut flower garden. So stay tuned for that. First things first, most of the roses are doing really well. This is Hot Princess. It is a florist rose. Those typically get disease and are not as good in the garden. They're more used to climate controlled environments like a greenhouse. That is not the case with Hot Princess. If you have a chance to get your hands on this rose, cannot recommend it enough. Steve Singer sells it, K&M Roses sells it. It traditionally has these nice long canes, what a lot of florist roses do. And even though I pruned it back, you can see it is quite tall and a very good growing rose. So this is doing well. Hopefully it will continue through the season. A couple of maintenance items as your roses get into the spring. Some roses will bloom one bloom to a stem like this, and that's perfectly fine. Others will do what's known as a spray. And what a spray is where you have multiple buds. So in this case, you've got 3 right here. If you leave it like that, you'll have a nice cluster of roses and a nice bouquet on one stem. The problem is they're at different levels of progression. Notice this one is really small. This one next to it is kind of medium size, and this one here, the terminal bud, is much farther along. So you really need to do one of two things. You don't have to do anything. You can just let it do its thing and it's fine. But if you are looking for something to do in the garden, again, this one actually has 4. It's actually on this one right here. If you get in there early, you have to make a decision. If you want the spray to continue, you leave the smaller buds and you take out the terminal bud. I'm going to do that in this case here in a second. If you want the long rows, single stem bloom per stem, you take out the 3 little ones. So it's really a decision. If you want a cluster, take out the big one, leave the 3 little ones. If you want 1 bloom per stem, take out the little ones and leave the big one. Do you have to do any of that? Of course not. But if you're looking for some things to do in the garden, that is something you certainly can do. So in terms of a rose show, if I had something like that, I would try to disbud it, is what it's called, early, so that I could have single stem roses and something that would be more conducive for the rose show itself. So here's an example here. This is Veterans Honor, and it's a good example because you have this nice thick stem, huge leaves. This would be a candidate for a queen in a rose show. And in this case, I just have one single one. It looks like I already disbudded the one on the one side, so I'll come in here and take out the little one. So now this one is ready for the rose show, and that's something I would take the side buds off because it has a nice huge cane, huge leaves, upright stem. That would be a good candidate for a potential queen in a rose show. So that's what disbudding is, either making your roses a spray by taking out the bigger terminal bud, or a single stem, 1 bloom per stem, by taking out the smaller ones. The other thing I wanted to point out is spraying in the garden. Overall, these new leaves look good because I've been into a regular spray routine. We did have some issues, and I can see some issues with powdery mildew. Early with this new growth, I get it in the spring and the fall. Notice how these leaves are curling a little bit, and this is why it's good to come out and just take a peek at your roses a couple times a week. But anytime the rose is curling like that, it's a sign of something, and this has progressed enough you can actually see the white, white gets its name, the powdery mildew part, the white there, and you can see a little bit on the back side of the rose. So I'll have to switch up my spray. I use microbutanol, Eagle is the trade name. So I'll have to spray a little of that. We're kind of into the season right here in the spring. We're dry. We still have some cool nights and also some dry weather and cool nights, temperatures getting into the 50s, kind of conducive for that. I noticed in upstate Newark, we tended to get it in the spring months and again in the fall. But overall, the rose is looking really good. The other thing I've been spraying for is black spot. Some of the newer leaves are fine, but I noticed that I had some black spot in some of my roses, and it was a mistake with, well, one, I never start my spraying program early enough, but these particular roses, I didn't realize were getting hit by the lawn sprinklers. And we always say you don't want wet leaves at night. So that's an issue I'm gonna be battling here as we get into the spring. One thing that can creep up in the springtime and also the fall, I showed you on Hot Princess, I didn't have too much of it, but it's something called powdery mildew. The first signs you'll see, as I showed you on Hot Princess, is kind of a crinkling of the leaves, and eventually in later stages you'll actually see this white, kind of the spores of the powdery mildew itself. If it's really infected like this one here, you can clearly see the white spores on top, the crinkling leaves and folding under. That's a good candidate for just removal. So in that case, you would just cut that out. And that's what I'll probably do with this. This is a firm. This is a rose that is more susceptible to mildew than others. I showed you a little bit of it on Hot Princess, but again, those first couple signs, sometimes you'll see a reddening of the leaves and a crinkling to them. And I don't mean red like new growth. It does affect new growth, but you'll just kind of see this reddish hue to the leaves, and eventually where it gets worse, you'll see the white underneath. I will link or include an image of Eagle mycobutanol is what I use, and that should clear that up pretty quickly. Just because you have it on this rose bush doesn't mean you'll get it throughout the garden. Some roses are more susceptible than others. It primarily affects new growth, and for me, I've noticed it in the spring and fall, especially when you have those 70 and 80 degree days and those cool 40 and 50 degree nights. It really can inhibit the new growth on plants. So it's something that you'll want to watch out for. And again, I'll link below on how to prevent that in terms of spraying. I mentioned I'm trying some other things in the garden. The raspberries there and blackberries there are doing really well. I'm going to do a more prolonged video on this, but the roses from Steve Singer, the maiden roses, Keepsake and Dublin, they're doing really well in the garden so far. Look for a more updated video on those in terms of the progression, what a maiden rose is, and how to purchase one. I'll have that in the coming weeks. Want to end with what else you can be doing in the garden. As the roses are really starting to do well, after your main pruning in the early part of spring, come back out here again and examine the bush. For the most part, this one is doing okay. This is Dilate Parton, but you'll notice some canes are dying. You didn't do anything wrong. This is just something that when you did your initial pruning, maybe you had a cane that was kind of on the fence and you weren't sure, so you just left it. Now it's much more obvious that that cane is dead. So something obvious like this, just prune back until you get to green. And again, when you do that, you want to prune low enough on the cane that you don't see any of that inner pith, the cane itself, being dark or discolored. Prune back until you see white pith, and what I'm talking about is the center part of the cane should look fresh. Other times you can look at a cane and it's harder to tell, especially when it's woody like this. This to me still looks like it might be okay, but unfortunately a sign that says it might not be okay is the growth coming out of it is dying off and not doing really well. So sometimes it's obvious if it's a dark black to prune it out. Other times really wait to see is what is coming off of it alive or dead. Here's an example of that. Here's another woody cane. It looks very similar to the last one I showed you, but I know it's doing well because of all that new growth. And overall, Mr. Lincoln will bounce back because look at this down here. This is by the base of the plant, by the bud union. This is a basal break. So those are new shoots, and that is good news. So the whole point of this is, yes, overall, things are looking really good into the spring. Continue your spraying, eventually more for black spot as we get into the summer. But you may have some issues with powdery mildew. And again, if you have some dieback on your plants, be sure to take that out as you get through the spring months. Last thing you'll notice, there are some weeds popping up. I put down a pre-emergent in the spring, late winter, and that kept most of the weeds at bay. But on the label, it does not prevent grassy weeds like nutsedge. So now's a good time to remove that before it gets out of control. I'm going to apply some organics, and they need to be scratched in. Things like cottonseed meal, alfalfa meal, and hollytone. So I need to scratch that in. So my agenda today, clear out some of the dead wood, do a little weeding, and since I need to disturb the garden anyway, to scratch in those organics, I'm going to reapply the pre-emergent. I usually do it late winter and mid-spring, so this will be my second course. We'll do a video on this coming up. This is alfalfa tea that's brewing, really trying to jumpstart the garden as we warm up here through the month of April. So that's it. We covered spraying. You certainly want to start that spray program after you prune. If you haven't started it now, don't wait, because if you get any disease that creeps up in the garden, it's much harder to get rid of once you already have it. Preventive spray is much more successful in your garden. We covered disbudding. As your buds come out, you can kind of shape the way the bush is by having single stem roses or sprays. We covered dieback. You're still going to have really nice bushes into the spring, but occasionally you'll find some new canes that you've got to prune out because they died back and they weren't quite as clear at your initial pruning. We also started to hint at some future videos. We're going to talk about Steve Singer's roses, alfalfa tea, and I mentioned a cut garden. One of the next videos we're going to talk about is what I'm doing with these seedlings, zinnias and cosmos, and how I'm using these tubs to cover them up at night. And I really like this system. I'll just show you really quickly. During the day, if it's not quite as cool, I will just put a fire log underneath to kind of keep it raised and get it some ventilation. A day like today is super warm, so I don't want them covered. So we're going to talk about that in the future in terms of cut flowers. And you'll notice my paths are all mulched in and there's cardboard down. I've got a whole video. I'm just waiting to finish to do that. And this area here is going to be our sunflower garden. So a lot to talk about with that. So stay tuned for some of those videos coming up. I'll last leave you with some pictures and shots of the roses. As far as in the ground, the first one that is always first to bloom is Yolande De Aragon. It is our old garden rose. This was pruned in the late winter. You can see it's doing quite well, but it has these very fragrant clusters of flowers. Again, it's a very nice old garden rose, 1843. So that'll be the first to bloom in the garden. The first to bloom in the actual garden now is cheating a little bit. I say cheating a little bit because these are in pots. I don't really count these as my first blooms. These were potted up at bare root roses from John Smith. This is Sunny Sundays. I'll post some still photos where the rose looked a little bit better, but that's quite a color contrast there. There's an open bloom of Sunny Sundays. And again, I'll do some stills here to round out this video because they looked a little bit better a couple days ago, but that's still very nice. That's Randy Scott. That's a nice exhibition rose there, and you can see it looks really nice. Look at that coloring. Just a nice white with a hint of yellow. That's a nice open bloom of Randy Scott. Two really good exhibition roses from John Smith, Sunny Sundays and Randy Scott. So that's it. Got a lot of work to do in the garden today. Look for those future videos on the maiden roses. What am I doing with these wood mulch paths? And a little bit more on some of the organics I'll be putting down in the garden. Hope everyone's doing well, and as always, I appreciate the new subscribers.